Welcome to the EAC offices. We're coming live on our maiden voyage on Facebook Live this morning. So for those tuning in on Facebook, please feel free to share this discussion and let other folks know this is going on. On this, the first full day of spring, the EAC is focusing on the election version of spring cleaning this morning. Voter-less maintenance, best practices, tools, and success stories, discussion hosted by the Election Assistance Commission. As those in elections know, having accurate, up-to-date voter rolls is at the heart of having secure and accurate elections. As the folks at this table, who I'll introduce shortly, are aware, the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, has requirements in it for both the registration of eligible voters and the proper process for keeping the voter rolls current. This is why good list maintenance processes, including activities that work to ensure the addition of up-to-date, accurate info for new registrants, for those who have moved and need to update their information, as well as the removal of those voters who are no longer eligible. In order to do this well, data must be provided and exchanged efficiently and timely. This process is akin to painting the Golden Gate Bridge or doing laundry for a family at home, constant and never ending. Once you finish the cycle or the load, it's time to start all over again and begin the process anew. It requires constant vigilance and attention. Good list maintenance processes ensure not only the integrity of the process, but are also at the very core of providing high-quality customer service to voters. They work to shorten lines, they ensure voting by mail ballots are sent to the proper person at the proper address, they lessen the number of provisional ballots, they work to enfranchise voters, and ultimately improve voters' confidence and faith in the process. This is why no one wants current and accurate voter lists more than those local election administrators who serve those voters. Today we'll explore a variety of techniques, best practices, and tools that are used to ensure current voter rolls, as well as looking at some of the challenges election officials face in accomplishing this task. This will include discussing data sharing efforts like the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, and the Interstate Cross-Check Program, the use and importance of the United States Postal Service in this process, online voter registration, how to ensure the proper addition and removal of voter from the rolls, and how to measure success in this process and benchmark to ensure that you're executing the process efficiently and accurately. We're fortunate to have four incredible panelists with us here today. I'm going to start on my right with introductions. I'm going to introduce each panelist, give you a couple minutes kind of just to intro the topic as you see it, and then we'll get into a series of questions. I want this to be conversational, engaging, so feel free to weigh in on any topic or question that we provide. So first I'd like to start on my right here. This is Tammie Shue. Tammie was elected Douglas County Clerk in 2004 and recently re-elected to the position, so congratulations. As County Clerk, Mr. Shue is responsible for administering all national, state, and local elections, as well as processing county claims and payroll, issuing licenses, and all kinds of other activities in your office. So Tammie, thank you for being here with us today. Why don't you get us started talking about this process?
Well, thank you, Matt. You know, when I think about list maintenance, it doesn't sound very sexy, but it is the foundation. It's the foundation of everything that we do, and elections can't run without, from start to finish, we're constantly working on list maintenance. And one of the big things that we talk about is it requires buy-in from everybody from election board workers all the way to your staff to the voters, to take some sort of responsibility to make sure that the list is as accurate as possible. We'll talk about as we go through this, but I'm a university town with the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk. I also have two other universities, and so I have a huge challenge in that I have a very transitory community, and so list maintenance is something that we work on every day. It is something that easily can fall to the wayside because we have so many other challenges that it's easy to say we'll do that tomorrow. But if you really only do it once a year, you're behind. And so it's one thing that you just every day have to continually be working on. So I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Tammie. I appreciate you being here and engaging in the conversation. Next to Tammie is a face that needs no introduction here in the election world, Tammie Patrick, Democracy Project Fellow with the Bipartisan Policy Center, focusing on the recommendations from the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Of course, a commissioner on the PCA as well. And so Tammie, thank you for being here, for sharing your knowledge, and also a little bit of the background on the importance of list maintenance that the report spoke to. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Well, I really appreciate the invitation to talk this morning. And I particularly appreciate your teeing this up as a dad with 2 small children about the laundry reference. I thought that was perfect because it really is a process that is ongoing. And accuracy, we hear about the research and the reports of 1 in 8 records being incorrect. We know that we have a mobile population. We also know that our voters have an expectation and an understanding of voter registration that is not always aligned with our statutory duties. So the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, we really took a holistic approach on voter registration. And in the report, we actually said that election officials across the political spectrum recognize the value of accurate and manageable rolls. This is not a partisan issue. And in the report, we wrote it really looking at all the audiences that deal with voter registration. And I think that's critical as well, to know that it's the legislature, it's the state officials, it's the local officials. Because you talk about things like online voter registration. And when you talk about the accuracy, when I was a local official in Arizona, I did a study of all of the records that didn't make it onto the rolls, that were on a suspense status, and how many of those were paper forms versus online voter registration. And they were predominantly paper forms that were submitted, even though the vast majority of our registrations came from online voter registration. So there's a disproportionate amount of failure is in the paper records. We also reference that you should have intrastate and interstate data sharing programs, like you mentioned. Also integrating your information with the Department of Motor Vehicles. But there are other things like the use of electronic poll books that can really benefit on the efficiencies of having accurate and most current and up-to-date rolls. And one of the parts of the report that sometimes get overlooked in these discussions has to do with our military and overseas voters. So really, what puts a voter on the official voter rolls? Does the federal postcard application make them an eligible, active, registered voter, or are they in some sort of temporary status? And how is that list maintenance done, and how is that play out across the state, which is very done in a variety of ways. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I think it's going to be a great morning.
Awesome, and thank you. You've teed up something we'll talk in a little bit, which is about modernizing and the tools available to election officials now that perhaps weren't available certainly when the NVRA was passed, and how that process has moved forward. To my left here, and next up is Don Palmer, Tammie's co-worker at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Don is unique in that he has run elections in 2 swing states, and in doing so, he's also implemented both the cross-check program and the ERIC program in Virginia, as well as the work he did in Florida as the state election director. Prior to that, Don worked for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And Don, thanks for being here and being willing to talk about this.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Masterson. Thank you for having me. I want to weigh in on the importance of list maintenance. It's with the exception of preparing for Election Day, and Election Day is probably the most important thing you'll do as a local or state election official. And it really is trying to keep them up to date in a mobile society where individuals don't often contact their election official to let them know that they're moving. But it comes down to federal law, which federal law says, listen, the integrity of the list is important. And these are some of the measures that you should take to maintain the integrity of your voter rolls. And when that doesn't happen, and when the rolls become messy and a little bit inaccurate, what happens is what we had in 2012 and 8. Sometimes you have long lines and congestion at the polls. And so what the President's Commission on Election Administration looked at, and the Bipartisan Policy Center has continued to look at very closely, is how does this impact voters? And when you have inaccurate rolls, there is downstream issues that will occur. If you have inaccurate poll books or inaccurate registration rolls, you're going to have some congestion, you're going to have lines, you're going to have more provisional voters than normal. So there's impact of this. And so it's a holistic process where you want to increase access for registration, but you also want to maintain the integrity of the polling place. So when people come to the polling place where it all takes place, democracy takes place, it's a very efficient and timely process, and voters don't feel negatively impacted. So I look forward to the discussion on that, and thank you.
No, thank you for being here, and you flagged an important point that we'll get back to as well, which is the impact on the voter experience. I know that's something that the PCA looked heavily at as we talk about both adding folks and the ease of online registration and those tools, as well as how we keep the rolls current and up to date. what is the tangible impact on the voter experience? Finally, Secretary of State Mac Warner from the great state of West Virginia is here with us. Secretary Warner was elected to become West Virginia's 30th Secretary of State in 2016. 60 days, right, or so in the office. And so Secretary Warner is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, West Virginia College of Law, 2 Master of Law degrees, one in military law and one from the Army Judge Advocate General School, and one in international law from the University of Virginia. So a heck of a background, Secretary Warner, and I appreciate you being here, and the reason we wanted you here is to share your experience coming into the office and having this process basically starting as you take the helm, and how you've worked with your local election officials to begin the process in West Virginia and do this. So Secretary Warner, thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be on this panel. And I have about 60 days in the office, so I am the new guy on the block. I think what I can bring, though, to this discussion is first a military background where I've been across the world and seen a number of people striving for democracy. They don't have what we sometimes take for granted. And then working with the State Department in Afghanistan, where I've actually seen people with a finger chopped off. Their voter identification is sticking a finger in a purple inkwell. But when the Taliban sees that purple ink on the finger, they'll chop the finger off to let people know that they don't want people in Afghanistan participating in those Western-style democracies. So I bring a real enthusiasm to the job. I'm really enjoying this job as Secretary of State in West Virginia. And though I don't have a lot of experience in the job of Secretary of State, what I do have is a year's worth of campaigning that took me around to 55 counties. And I really love West Virginia, so this gave me a great reason to get around and visit those counties and to listen to clerks. And I think the thing that you'll be hearing from me today is the importance of listening to folks, communicating your ideas, and then leading, picking what you've heard and applying that in action. And so we've got some great clerks throughout West Virginia who want to do the job, want to clean up those lists, and they simply need the tools. Another thing you're going to hear, I always refer back to, is that three-legged stool. To get anything done, you need to have the resources to get it done. You have to have the training or the competence to get it done. But the most important factor is the will. You have to decide, this is what I'm going to do. And so when you get those 3 things working together, then you can accomplish great tasks. And what I've chosen to lead off in West Virginia is cleaning up the voter rolls has been the task that I've decided, among many others that are coming at us, but that's the one I've focused on the most.
Great, and I look forward to following up with you on how you've begun building those relationships with the counties. Particularly, I know West Virginia, not unlike many states, is diverse in the size of the counties and the number of resources or amount of resources available to various counties. So I look forward to talking to you about that. Before we kind of get into some of the individual issues we've already raised and off to a really good start, I want to start with you, Jamie. You're the boots on the ground. You're the one administering elections in your county, serving those voters. And I want you to walk us through, how does the list maintenance process work in Kansas? Nuts and bolts, how does the process work, so that we can understand that as a starting point?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned is it's from the moment a person submits their registration through their lifetime as a voter, is you're constantly doing list maintenance. So even a lot of people think maybe list maintenance is once they're on the rolls, going through the NVRA process, but it starts once you get that registration and doing a duplicate check and making sure, are they registered somewhere else in the state of Kansas, or are they registered in another state through interstate cross-check, all of those things that happen before they're really on the rolls. And then when they're on the rolls, making sure that everybody has a buy-in, that the voter knows. So education's a huge part of this, is the voter knows if you move, you need to tell us. There's an assumption among voters that we automatically know through osmosis that they moved. We're a government, they told the post office, so therefore we should know. So part of it is letting the voters know you have a responsibility to tell us, but then also just keeping up with your NVRA rules and making sure that whether you're doing NCOA, whether you're doing the mailing, however you're doing NVRA, that you're doing it, so that you're constantly making sure that you have your inactives on file, so that when you go through those couple federal elections, you can then do your list maintenance after that. Because until you have those voters as inactive, you cannot start their NVA process. And so that's one thing where people make a mistake. The other thing is election day. A lot of people don't realize that list maintenance is a huge part of election day. When that voter comes in and they say to the poll worker, my daughter moved or my son moved, that the poll worker gets that information to us, and that we start that process. And so we forget that election day is a huge part of that. And then after that, you're just constantly working with your Social Security index, with your state agencies. You're cross-checking all of your different resources that you have, that you're going through death records, and you're just constantly using all of those resources. And one of the things I'll talk about as we go along is there's resources now with the internet for being able to try to find where a person may live, to give them that information, because the easiest way to get somebody off the list is that they tell you. But that's also the hardest way, because having them tell you can be difficult. So that's a huge part of it. Every day you're doing those things in order to try to have as accurate list as possible. Did that kind of explain it?
Yeah, that's, and you've actually just teed up, I have a feeling, quite a bit of thoughts, but you mentioned several inputs that I just want to make sure. So you've got inputs from the voter themselves, you've got inputs from your Bureau of Motor Vehicles or Department of Motor Vehicles, whatever you call it, in your state. You have inputs from the United States Postal Service, you have inputs from some commercial information, or where you could find, you mentioned the internet and information there. And yeah, deceased death list, Social Security Administration. So the question is, and this can go to the panel as a whole, how do state and local administrators get this information, process it, and make sure that they can efficiently manage the list with all of these inputs coming at you? So I'll start with you, but anyone can weigh in.
Well, I would just follow up that I think that election day is sort of like March Madness, right, with the tournament. But you don't get there unless you have good preparation the rest of the year. And so, you know, a good list will mean a good election. But I think that the inputs that you get, that's where you need a good IT manager, frankly, from the state level. You need a good IT manager to make sure that the inputs that you're getting from dozens of sources, at least we did in Virginia, is making its way down to the localities so they can actually use it to remove deceased voters, to update registrations. You know, so that is really the key from a state perspective. How can I get that information from a state and go above and beyond what HAVA sort of minimally requires? Because we've learned that HAVA helps us within a state, but once you start going outside the state, you need other sources like the interstate registration systems like ERIC or IVRC, which is cross-check. But to do that, from a state perspective, you have to make sure that the localities the users can use that in sort of in updating or the list maintenance process.
And if I could, Matt, I think that also, and Don touched on this briefly, there is one place that will gather some of that input for you. So ERIC has NCOA data, it has the Social Security information, it has the death index, it has a number of those inputs, as well as the Department of Motor Vehicles, as an integral function of what the ERIC data sorting does. So that's one way of kind of narrowing the field on how many different inputs you have, and it also, and I'm going to say common data format because I'm beating you to the punch. If anyone's playing Commissioner Masterson Bingo at home, that's the beat. So in the common data format, that's one of the beautiful parts of the ERIC kind of structure and architecture, is that it takes all these inputs and puts it into a single format for the states to make it more easily consumed.
So let's take that, and you mentioned something very important. I'll put this to Secretary Warner first, but others should weigh in, and that is, you mentioned the education, both the education of the voters and the education of the clerks, right, on how the process is going to work, how you're getting these inputs, how you're reaching out. And so the question is, how have you, coming into office, you know, learning this process, how have you begun the process of both educating yourself and your local election officials on how this process works and how you're going to work together to do this process?
Well, I'm glad you brought that into perspective. The clerks have been educating me, and that's why I'll go back to the campaigning. The importance of getting out and talking to all 55, in all 55 counties, and listening to the clerks. And as we discussed earlier before the show, what works in one county, say Kanawha County, the capital, of West Virginia may not work in Braxton County, another smaller county with much less population and a much more. There, I would think the clerk almost knows, if not everybody in the county, somebody in in their families. They know when people move and die and that sort of thing. There's no way that the clerk in Kanawha County can keep up with the vast number. So I have to listen to the clerks and hear what's working for them, what systems they're using. But then when we bring in something like ERIC, that is a new process for, if not all, most of the clerks. And the regime that you have to follow when you're into the ERIC system and the timelines. And what we found in West Virginia was my predecessor, it was somewhat of a top-down system and got us engaged in ERIC without that discussion with the county clerks. And it was just almost jammed down on them right before the election. There were 300,000 postcards that were sent out 3 to 4 weeks prior to the election, the general election. And on the card it said, if you have questions about this was due to the ERIC system, if you have questions, contact your county clerks. Well, the county clerks were up in arms about this because they had not been informed ahead of time that this process was taking place. And so as soon as the election was over, the clerks came to me and they wanted to disband. They did not want to fund the ERIC system for the next year, and they wanted to take away the requirement that the Secretary of State have the authority to do list maintenance if the clerks failed to do so. They wanted to take away that authority. So they were very distrustful of the ERIC system. So we realized we had our work cut out for us. As soon as we took office in January, we were out talking with clerks, having clerk meetings. I continue that process today. We've implemented a field representative program where I have human contact with those clerks so that they can voice their concerns. We've also started a weekly phone call with those clerks so that we're putting out with one voice, educating them about this ERIC process, informing them about the cross-check, the interstate cross-check system, as well as the implications on this. They're all familiar with the NCOA process, but these other tools are going to impact that NCOA process as we go along. So it's a communication. It's having that dialogue with them, an open dialogue where they are informing me and then we're informing them at the same time. So I just can't emphasize, in the military, we call the chain of command, keeping the chain of command informed, up the chain and down the chain, as well as your peers, your other commands of the same command structure. In the State Department, they call it socializing an idea. You had to socialize it. So again, put yourself in the Afghanistan situation. We had to socialize our ideas with our Afghan counterparts, the Supreme Court, the Ministry of Justice, the Attorney General's office, and so on. We had to inform the United States, various departments, Department of Justice, Department of Defense, that sort of thing. We had to form our international counterparts, okay, and the World Bank. So you had to socialize these ideas before you just came in and said, we're going to implement a new program. So again, taking that skill set from those various bureaucracies and bringing it into the state government, it's allowed me, I think, an opportunity to listen, and as well as to pick what are the most important things at what time do we need to emphasize, and that's where I get to the lead part of the discussion.
Well, I'm assuming to the two local election officials here, that's music to your ears, that level of communication and education, particularly local election officials are inherently risk mitigators, right? And so uncertainty or surprises are the thing you like the least. And so we've had a couple times the word NCOA brought up and National Change of Address. And Tammie, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role NCOA and more importantly, the United States Postal Service plays in list maintenance.
Sure. So, the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act, really lays out quite a role for the United States Postal Service to play in the registration process. But it's even a little bit more than that, because when it comes to the address itself, a lot of us rely on the USPS mailing address or an address as a part of a trigger for whether or not that voter remains active or inactive. And I think it's interesting, just recently there was a meeting at the Postal Service, and they said that they add more than 100,000 new addresses every month. That's a critical piece to consider when you're thinking about using National Change of Address. If you're not using it on a regular basis, you're now missing hundreds, potentially, of thousands of addresses that are new in your area. Additionally, every year the Postal Service has more than 900 million undeliverable as addressed mail pieces. So why are they not being delivered? What are the number one factors? Well, the number one main reason for a bad address is the lack of a unit number. So if we know that it's a mailing address for an apartment complex in our voter registration systems, if we know when we're registering a voter that we need to ask them for that unit number, it's going to prevent that mail piece from coming back to us and preventing that voter from remaining as an active voter. So there are things like that that we can educate ourselves on as election administrators and know that having the lack of unit number, having the incorrect house number within a given range, these are all issues that can particularly be prevented if you're using online voter registration, because you can build in logic into your system to make sure the voter's providing you with the information necessary to actively and fully register them. But once they get on the rolls, we do have the National Change of Address. National Change of Address is put out every 2 weeks by the Postal Service. So if you're doing NCOA once a year, twice a year, again, you're not leveraging all of that information. But there are other services that we don't talk about as much in the election realm, and one of them is called ACS, and that's the Address Correction or Address Change Service. What ACS is, and any of you have been in an elections office and you've seen all those piles of envelopes with the yellow sticker, and you've hired probably dozens and dozens of people to rekey that information when those mail pieces come back as temporarily away, moved, called forwarding. That information that's being rekeyed can all be received electronically via ACS. So you don't have to rekey it. When I found out about that when I was at Maricopa County Elections Office, the light bulb went off, and we did a study and we estimated in a federal cycle it was going to save the county over $500,000, because we wouldn't be able to get the information into the system between a primary and a general election fast enough to prevent a ballot from being mailed out to a voter when a ballot had been returned for a bad address. And so when you start looking at all the cost savings, some of these services through the Postal Service do have a fee associated with them, but the cost savings plus the ability for you to have a more accurate voter roll and the voting experience, it far outweighs what those investments are. And quite frankly, a number of states are moving to automatically acting on NCOA data. So instead of having the NCOA data trigger a mailing to the voter to say, we think that you've moved, if you have moved, contact us back and we'll get your registration moved, they're sending it to them saying, we see you've moved, we've updated your voter registration. If this is incorrect, let us know. And they've found some great efficiencies there by doing that.
One of the things that's really important for a local election official is to recognize what the problems are with each system. NCOA is great. One of the struggles I have is I have a lot of people that go to Arizona for 6 months. They don't like Kansas winter, and they show up on NCOA. And so sometimes you have to put on your VR records notes that say, don't move this person. Because they're in Arizona for the next 6 months. And so whatever system you're working on, make sure that you've got lots of double checks, that you're not just acting on something, follow your NVRA process. And on top of that is, know for each one of the systems, there could be mistakes. I mean, even the Social Security Index, we had an individual who was mistakenly made dead. And he had spent months trying to fix that. Yeah. Yes,
that's a big error. That's a bad day.
Yeah, it really was. When he was like 90, and when we talked to him, he just sighed and was like, "Okay, one more thing I've got to fix." So there are errors, and there are things that you have to make sure that you're not just totally relying on that data.
One thing about NCOA is not everybody uses NCOA. We wish they would, and it has been increasing. Somewhere between 50 and 70% use it. In Virginia, it was as high as 70%. In other states, it's lower, around 50%. The problem is how do we contact those other voters? How do we sort of try to keep up with their mobility? And that's a challenge. Sometimes it's got to be the list maintenance mailings and the use of commercial data to understand what is the best and the most current address so you can reach out to that voter.
So I wanted to follow up on a comment, and it goes to that point as well, which is a voter education point. With those voters not wanting to go through the Kansas winter, as you said, how do you educate both your staff and those voters to let you know, to tell you that I'm sure you just get an angry phone call like, why'd you move me? Or how do you reach out to the voters and educate them on that? And then,
well, I have an idea on that. I really encourage the registration drives and the registration sort of PR campaigns. I also think it's important, though, that individuals sort of get the message that we don't have a magical way of following you. And please update your registration. Be kind to your election official, because the best way to update your registration is you personally, either through an online voter registration system, or it's an online system, or calling or sending a letter or a note to your election official, letting them know I'm going to be gone for 6 months, or I'm moving. Those type of things are really great for your election official, because there is no magic bullet for the voters. So any way that we could have sort of campaigns, PR campaigns out there, that please update your registration, let your election official know that you are moving or you have moved into a new jurisdiction, that would be kind.
I think, you know, like we do the I'm Voting campaign right before the election, and big part of that is check your registration. You know, we have online registration, so you can go in, put your registration in, you can put your name and your birthday, and is that registration correct? And if not, contact us. The other thing for staff is document, document, document. So if that person does call, you make a note in their VR record so that we don't make that mistake. But let's say they move to another county. So we're used to that person who always, you know, moves, but they move to another county. So you want that on their record so that next county has that note that says this person goes to Arizona for the next 6 months. So a big part of this whole process is that you document what you're doing, that you're scanning in those documents, that you're leaving a paper trail so that you can prove what you did. Partially because when that voter calls and they yell, why did this happen? You can look it up and say, oh, we got this notice. Is that not correct? So that's a huge part of this entire process.
So the reality is, for election administrators at the state and local level, you can reach out, you can have online voter registration, which is a huge positive, which we'll talk about in a second. You can have various campaigns, but the election office is about the last place people think to contact, right? They know, oh, I probably have to update my license, right? They know the post office, we're going to talk to them. And so let's talk a little bit about the ways that you go about getting that data, whether it's either commercially available or through the Postal Service or the BMV. How have you set up those partnerships to at least get the most up-to-date information you can in order to get that? Eric being one of them. So I'll start with you,
okay.
Talking about the data exchange programs that are out there and how that's approached.
Well, particularly from a state level, you know, it's a national problem. Our voter registration rolls are outdated. A lot of them are inaccurate. So it's a national problem. And so one of the things the President's Commission on Election Administration looked at, and the Bipartisan Policy Center is continuing to look at, is how do we communicate with each other as states? Right now there are two programs. One of them is the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC. Not every member of the state of the union is part of that organization. I really encourage those states or local election administrators who are not part of it to really take a look at this, because it works obviously better if everybody is a part of it, because then we have everybody's voter registration rolls. We're able to compare them. But we also have the DMV databases, so we actually can compare those databases with it. The more states are involved, the better this program is going to be. And so we encourage them to do that. Now, we implemented it in Virginia. We're one of the initial members of it. And part of that is sort of, you're taking this data and you receive it in reports, and sort of our goal, as we
just
discussed.
What is this data? Tammie touched on this a little bit. What are the data feeds that come into ERIC that help to do this?
You're identifying, obviously, the individuals that have moved to your state from another participating member, okay? And you're also going to find out, because of the software, it's able to identify duplicate registrations within the state. Because of the DMV data, it's able to identify folks that have moved within your state to another county, for example, that you weren't aware of. And it's also able to identify eligible but not registered individuals. So it gives you a slew of reports at the state level. And then the challenge is how do I provide that to my counties or to my localities in a manageable way? And that was the big effort that we had to do in Virginia, and most states have to do. But it's very important because it's very valuable data. And once a state becomes a really functioning member of ERIC, they're going to see some dividends they're going to see some dividends with their voter registration rolls. So that was our challenge. Is that, you know, we have our statewide voter registration systems. We have all these inputs coming from, you know, Social Security, on deceased information or corrections for the felons, voter registrations. It all is going down through the voter registration system to the localities. We wanted to make ERIC a seamless part of that. So it wasn't a big shock to the system.
What steps did you take to make it a seamless part? There's the conversation part with your locals, but then there's also a technical part, right? About how to get in. You don't need to get into the really specific.
I became very good friends with my IT manager,
yeah,
Matt
right.
Davis.
But talk about that conversation, because for states that haven't joined yet or are looking to join, that's a really important part of this, because it's not just the technical within your state office. It's the challenges you face in exchanging that data down to the local offices as well, and how they take that
Well,
data.
and this gets into Secretary Warner's point. He mentioned the term socialize, you know, the idea. Well, I knew from the very beginning that, listen, our localities are not gonna push off on this if they see it as part of what they've been doing in the past. So it's normalized action. It's just another report. It's just additional information, because they're starving for this data. So my goal was to keep it. I want it to look the same. I want it to smell the same. I want it to be the same. I want everything to be the same, except this is additional great address data. And so that was the goal of our IT team, is to make it part of our already existing infrastructure and system. Now, that may not work in all states, but I think that really sort of minimized opposition, or sort of the learning curve on this. To listen, this is a great idea that the Secretary of State's office is bringing in. This is how we're going to do it. It's not going to be a huge change. We're going to have all the procedures laid out for you. That was the big challenge. But I think that we got buy-in from the localities. They liked the idea. We were able to talk to them about ERIC, and I think the implementation phase went very well. It also had buy-in from all the stakeholders, including the legislature and the executive branch. So there was buy-in.
If I could, I think that Don's absolutely right. You know, when you look at the function of ERIC, and even the reports, what's coming in, and the outputs, the sort of mailings that the states have chosen to do, it's just an expansion of a pre-existing structure that they're already doing. Because they already have a mechanism in place when they think there's a duplicate in state. They already have a mechanism in place for when they find that someone is potentially registered outside the state. So it's just building on those pre-existing architectures. And I think that one of the surprises that states that joined ERIC found was that the number of duplicates that they were able to identify within their own state. States that thought they had very robust list maintenance procedures, the numbers on the ERIC website, they have some really good statistics, and in the first 4 years, and this is only with 12 states and DC reporting, they had 1.3, well, that was just 1 year, 3.8, almost 4 million total in-state movers identified in just those 13 states over a couple of years. They had almost 100,000 in-state duplicates and 171,000 deceased on the rolls. Now we have almost twice that many states that have joined but are still implementing, and those numbers are just going to increase. For cross-state movers, it was a little more than 1 million. So really, the efficiencies here, even though the focus tends to be on cross-state and people who've moved, it really is just getting our arms around our own data set when a voter may use a nickname in one form in one county, and then when they move, they use their formalized name, or they've gotten married, and because of the sophistication, it's able to identify and clean up the roles in that regard.
Let me address a couple of these issues that have been brought up. One is just the constant communication with the clerks, and in our case, we had pulled some together and asked them if they wanted to update legislation. Our legislature is in session right now, and we had to do this in December, January to get that information. But at the time, we threw out this idea about ERIC to see what their reaction was, and that's when we found out that they were not interested in it at all because of the previous situation I mentioned. Then we used the next opportunity was a training session, and so we had an opportunity to talk to more clerks at that point. Then the Association of Counties had their statewide meeting, so we talked to more, about 20 or 30 of the clerks there, and each time we saw the tension going down because they were learning more and more about it. We have more training set, and then in June, just the county clerks are going to get together, and that's a chance for us to basically hit all of them at one time to level the field, as I mentioned before, plus those weekly phone calls where 20 to 30 of our clerks are participating in that. And they're getting more and more information each week as they have questions about this. So it's just that constant dialogue with them. It's lowering the tension and getting them educated on what we know, and then us hearing back from them the problems they see in the implementation of it. They all see, one of the things is there's going to be a huge bump in the amount of work that clerks have to do when we get that first draw from Eric, as well as the Kansas cross-check. And I think your numbers are proving out at the beginning. You mentioned 1 out of 8 registrations might be wrong. We're finding that's about the ratio in West Virginia. We've already, just since I've been in office, the clerks have taken off about 40,000 names, outdated registrations. It's looking like it's going to be over 100,000, maybe as many as 150,000, which is about 1/10 of the voter registrations in the state of West Virginia. So we're going to see whether that proves out, but it's looking like between Kansas Crosscheck and Eric, that's where we're going. And think of the amount of people, or the amount of registrations that are outdated, that are coming off those rolls, what that's going to mean in voter turnout numbers, participation, and I'm sure we're going to get to that later on. The people will see, they'll have more trust and confidence in the elections when they see those percentages going up, and it's simply a matter of getting the clerks the information, the tools to allow them to clean up the rolls.
One of the things that's really important when you talk about those duplicate checks is that it really requires a lot of diligence to not just go through and is an exact match. When we do our duplicate checks, what we find is we find a lot of them where there is a nickname that was used and it didn't catch it, or maiden names versus married names, it doesn't catch it. We actually have people who will misspell their names, and so it won't catch it. Or they give us the wrong birthday. And so when we match against the DMV, it's not a match. But when you look at it, you see that it is a match. And so it really requires the staff not just to go match, 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 but to look and see, oh, you know what, that may be a match. And that goes to the other part that I want to recognize is this requires a lot of resources. I like the three-legged stool. And there is the will and the competency from many local officials, but resources is a challenge. And I know a lot of officials, hopefully thousands, are watching this.
Millions.
Millions are watching this, and they're like, that all sounds great. I don't have time. I don't have the staff. I don't have the time. And for a lot of them are like me, elections is only a quarter of my job, according to my job description. And so it's really important that to recognize that across the board, we all have different levels of staffing. We all have different levels of what our responsibilities are. And so this takes a lot of resources. And it's really easy for you to just say, we'll do it tomorrow. And that's where it kind of falls off. And so it's great that the Secretary is working with the clerks. I think that's a huge part, is working with your state election official to help provide you those resources and that support, and that communication is huge.
Yeah, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
I would just say resources, I mean, this is an important issue. And like I said, I think it's just behind the administration of a successful election is that you need to have an ongoing program of list maintenance because of voter confidence. Resources are important. There is some cost to it, but it's an investment into our system. And I would just agree with Secretary Warner. One of the things, sometimes you don't know the extent of the problem until you see the problem. I sort of felt that there was a problem and that we needed to be a part of ERIC and IVRC. But only after I got the first amount of data back did I realize that it was a very wise decision, because we were talking about hundreds of thousands of voters that had moved from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we had absolutely no idea. And it showed that we had a lot of work to do. And so it will help you identify your problem, and then at least there's some tools in the toolbox to make a way to challenge that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And Commissioner, I was going to say, part of the other challenge here is there aren't mechanisms in place for voters to easily remove themselves from previous addresses. So all across the country, state voter registration forms have a field for a voter to put down their previous address. And it was surprising to me to find out that not all states key that data and notify the former jurisdiction Some states do, some states don't, and so I think that one thing that we can do moving forward as a modernization effort is for all the states that have online voter registration where they're asking voters for that information to be able to have a method or a way in which they can notify the other state that you had a voter that's now in my state, and I think that fully comports with the NVRA, and it allows that voter, because in many cases they felt like they've told their past jurisdiction because they put it on the voter registration form at the new state or the new jurisdiction, and that's not always the case in the way that that plays out.
Yeah, so lots of really good points to build off of. One of them being, you mentioned millions of records, you mentioned hundreds of thousands in both your states, and then you mentioned the important aspect of resources. And so it's part of this conversation is making the case that the time and energy and resources spent now, those hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, those are provisional ballots, those are wrongly mailed mail ballots in places, and that's resources you're going to have to spend somewhere else on the back end of the process. So can you talk a little bit about, and Tammie, we'll start with you, making the case around the importance of this because it saves resources on the front end, and talk about online voter registration in that context as well.
I would also say that if you're before a state legislature and you have nomination petitions that are based on number of registered voters, reminding those soon-to-be candidates potentially that they will be circulating petitions based on how many registered voters, and you want those rolls to be accurate because it can affect how many signatures they need to get.
And even more directly to the pocketbook, think of those candidates that are not having to send out mailing pieces to people that have moved, died, whatever.
So I think that there are a lot, it's far-reaching. But when it comes to things like online voter registration, I think, you have the increased accuracy because you have the voter keying the data. We've talked about that kind of ad nauseum. But additionally, it fits the way that our voters currently do business if you have the voter registration kind of where they are. And there are ways in which jurisdictions are effectively managing and leveraging having online voter registration. So for instance, all their registration verification mailings, anything that they send out to voters, having the URL for the online system or QR codes embedded with the voter's ID number, all of these are ways in which you can direct people to that channel, which is the most efficient and the most cost-effective channel for the voters to get registered and to get registered accurately. So I think that there are a variety of ways in which states and jurisdictions are using online voter registration. You have states that are creating APIs, which they're pushing out to third-party organizations to try and get those GOTV, those outreach mechanisms in the field to use online voter registration. The state of Washington and others are using a vanity URL, so that what happens is that you have these groups that are out registering voters, and what do they really want? They want to know the voter. They want to know a way to reach the voter so they can turn around and get that voter to turn out in addition to getting registered. So they have the ability to register them online, and then it goes directly to the Secretary of State's website. It's official, and the Secretary of State then pushes reports out, in some cases on a nightly basis, back to that third-party organization with all the publicly available information for the voter and none of the private information. So they don't have their signature, they don't have their date of birth, they don't have all of the other private information that's available on those paper forms. So it's far more secure. So there are a lot of ways in which it's being used, I think, around the country.
I wanted to follow up on something you had brought up earlier, and that was the majority of the mail that comes back is because there wasn't a unit address. And this was somebody came into my office just the other day and was talking about this. And the problem was on our registration form, there's just a block that says address. And when you're writing that out in longhand, you may just put 123 Maple Street, right, forgetting about putting in the apartment number or whatever. So then that mail piece comes back. Whereas, as you mentioned earlier, if you do that online, you can make a requirement that they fill this out, and you ask for an apartment number, and if they don't put it, it doesn't move forward or whatever. My point is I think it's incumbent upon us as officials to look at our processes and make sure that we've done everything we can. So the answer to this would be, instead of just putting an address block, you put an address, street, county, or city, state, apartment number, get all that information. At least have a line there that reminds somebody, oh yeah, they want that information. So there's just looking at the process by the official can help eliminate a lot of on the front end. And I can't believe that our form has been that way for decades. And so it's like, okay, go fix it. We can fix that right here in our office. As the next time we order forms, let's get it done properly.
Yeah, and I think that's something, I guess, a quasi-plug for the work that's been done on the usability of election forms, whether it's voter registration forms, the usability of online voter registration, the work done by Dana Chisnell, Whitney Quisenberry, and NIST, the EAC, on making those, because you're exactly right. If the voter's going to give you what you asked for, and they need to understand what you're asking for. And so the work that's been done on that, I think, has really improved the process.
Just to touch on the resources, I think that, and I think you've had Neil Kelly on. He is out of Orange County, California, and he really reduced his costs of the mailings that he does because he uses NCOA Plus, or the NCOA Plus, some commercial with this Experian data that gives you the most current and the best address, and he does it like quarterly. It might even be up more often than that. But what it does, it actually reduces the mailing costs that you do, because you are sending it to the address of the voter. You know that's the address of the voter. You know they've moved, so you're sending them a mailer just to confirm that and see if they can verify that. And so he's actually found dramatic savings with that, and it may be a tool that we could use in the future.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things is, you were talking about unit numbers, is that you empower your staff to find creative solutions. So I have a staff member who, she called around and got the contact information for all the apartment complexes, the sorority houses, fraternity houses, and the residence halls. So now when it comes through without a unit number, she knows that's up on the university. She calls that director, says, hey, what is this apartment number? And then we put it in. So you empower them to go seek that solution. I brought a visual aid. You were also talking about
we love visual aids.
Use of forms. We would send, we would find out somebody, was living somewhere else, and we'd send them a letter saying, hey, you need to remove yourselves from the rolls, and they just ignored us because it wasn't easy. So we created this postcard that says, I want to be removed from the rolls. Here's my former address. They sign it. They can send it to us electronically or whatever. Once we did this, our return rate was over 50%. Because we made it easy for them. And what we also did was we gave this to all the election board workers, so that whenever mom or dad comes in and says, oh, my son or daughter moved, rather than saying they need to tell us, they hand them one of these and they say, have them fill this out and send it back to the office. Just doing something as simple as this allowed us to really allow the voters to make it easy, because they want to make it easy to do it. Sending them a letter saying you need to tell us wasn't doing anything.
I think Ohio has an electronic version.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good point, is using what you have. So you're using that touch with the parents on election day. Other states are using things like Massachusetts is using their census. They do a yearly census, statewide census. They've been doing it for a very, very long time. And that's something that they use for their voter registration. The state of Alaska is using their dividend lists to maintain their voter rolls. So rethinking what you have available within your state or local government that could help inform your list maintenance process, and capitalizing on that.
I know several states also use the Department of Taxation. So when tax mailings go out, no voter's more engaged than when they're having to pay taxes, right? And so offering them registration information, either to update, to get registered, whatnot, via their tax mailings. Jamie, you mentioned it. I want to talk about the unique nature of your jurisdiction, being a university or college jurisdiction, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, and also abutting against an urban area, with Kansas City not being too far away from you, correct? And so what challenges do you face with a transient college population, as well as kind of being near a city that draws certainly some folks both away from your jurisdiction and into your jurisdiction, and how do you meet that challenge from a list maintenance perspective?
Well, we had a former city manager that said for every U-Haul coming in, there's one leaving Lawrence. And that's because we are so transient. I have an entire precinct that here in a couple months there will be no voters, because I have a precinct that has all of my residence halls. So I know it's empty in May, but I have 2,000 registered voters there. And when they all return to Lawrence in August, they will have moved somewhere else. And so list maintenance becomes a huge part of our process. And so it's kind of that we are working on it every day. And we can't just, kind of like what Tammie said, you can't just wait to do NCOA once a year. And then you have to get really creative. And so one of the things that we do is we run a household list off of our VR, and we can tell it's pretty obvious that those two couples don't live together. That couple's gone. They're inactive. How do we find them? So you can use other resources like commercial resources to find their address. Now you don't circumvent NVRA, but you find their address in another state, and then you send them this card and say, it looks like you moved. And so we use a lot of online resources to try to locate where they are. Everybody now has a digital record. And so you can, if you can locate them, especially students, they graduate from the University of Kansas, they go somewhere else. They don't think about that they registered for the last presidential election while they were a student, and now they're now living somewhere else. And so the big part for us is education. So at the start of campus, in August is talking to students about update your registration. We know you're registered, somewhere else, but then also we just work at it every day. And we know that that's a huge part of it.
What kind of partnerships have you formed with the university that allows you to have that interaction on education? What steps have you taken to do that?
Well, we use the student organizations like Student Senate and those organizations that do a lot of voter registrations. But working with the administration also, to, even as simple as when we get ready for a big election, the Chancellor's office will send out an email to all students and faculty and say, make sure that your registration's up to date. It's something as simple as that, but it's coming from the Chancellor. Mm-hmm. It has some weight to it. So reaching out to those organizations to just, even if it's just giving out that information for people to think about it, because students don't think about their voter registration until they show up to vote. And so I have tons of provisionals. Encouraging the use for us for satellite advanced voting, which is kind of like a vote center. So we can not have it be provisional, because once you get into the precinct-based situation, it is provisional. But with the universities, it's reaching out not only through your organizations, but through your administration to try to build those partnerships. And build them early. Don't wait until 2 weeks before the election to call them and say, would you help us? You do it now during the off time to prepare for your next election.
And once you've identified those dormitory addresses, you can look to see who you have registered there that's maybe been registered there for 10 years.
Right.
Or anything outside of the norm.
No judgment on that
No
student.
judgment
No
on that
judgment.
student, but the vast majority of students will be in a dormitory maybe for their first or second year, depending on the university, but not so much long-term for their entire college experience, although some will. The other way to do some quick list maintenance is to look at the number of individuals registered at a single dwelling house. So, and have just a basic query that you run periodically. Now there will be some places where you know that there are larger homes, or where you have a large family, but in general most addresses won't have 24 people registered there, and it's a way of identifying multiple dwelling places, but also places where those are tenants that are long gone, and it needs to be corrected.
And that, I touched on that one. That is a list we don't talk about much, but that for us it's called the household list. Right. Whatever your VR system is, that is a huge resource. Which is and it's huge, and it takes a long time, because you run every address and but it lists every voter, and you can identify, boy, that person hasn't voted in 10 years. It's pretty clear they don't live there. So how do we go find them? And then you empower your staff to really become part of that. And so they are like, all right, I'm gonna go find that person. I'm gonna get them this card, and we're gonna remove them. That you make it a mission of your office to continually be working on that list, and that it's not a chore. And it's kind of fun. I have staff members will be like, I found them.
Private investigator.
Right. I've been looking. I found them. They're living in South Dakota. I just sent them a thing. And then when they remove them, it's kind of a celebration of that's that person that we found.
So one of the things that is critical to a list maintenance process, not only keeping the list current and removing those but making sure you're not removing voters that shouldn't be removed. And so what steps do you take to ensure that the voters that should remain on the list do, and that you're not false flagging or falsely identifying those who shouldn't?
So some states, before they make any action, will send a notification to both addresses, the new and the old address, to make sure that if they're acting on bad information, or it's the junior senior situation or what have you, that they're making sure that they're notifying the person at both locations, and that's a fairly common practice. And then having additional safety net in place at the polls on election day, or should that voter turn up, is another way. Enabling the voters to be able to check their registration online and getting push notification for changes is something that some states are looking to offer, where a voter can sign up for more of an electronic service so that they receive text messages when their ballot's mailed out, or a text message when something changes on their record. And that's another way to, I think it increases not only the likelihood, or decreases the likelihood that someone will get removed erroneously, but it also increases the security of the system so that a person is notified if there's anything that they didn't take as an action on their account.
Strictly follow NVRA, and have strong written procedures that everybody in your staff knows and follows. Build that off of NVRA. Because you will have people that you flagged as inactive that will show up and vote, especially in a presidential. They only vote every 4 years. And so if you follow NVRA, that lead time of those 2 federal elections is a pretty long time. So if you flag somebody as inactive, make sure that you've followed it, and that's the time you'll probably find them in that time. So make sure that your processes follow that. That's a huge part. But make sure that you have gone through the process to make them inactive. When I took office, most of my precincts had about a 15 to 20% inactives. They hadn't gone to that second step of then removing them and so forth. So our goal is somewhere about 5 to 7% inactives for most precincts. So the first step is doing your mailings in order to first get them into the inactive status, and then the 2 federal elections. So following NVRA is the biggest thing that you can do.
Just follow up on that. I think that in addition to that is the use of the latest tools and the latest technology. It sort of increases the accuracy of what we're doing, and so there's less mistakes. Now most of these, I mean, NCOA, there's all types, there's some errors that occur, and so using the latest technology and not sticking with what we did 10, 20 years ago may not be for what we are as a society in 2017. For example, the use of Social Security number with cross-check, we added that, and a lot of states do, and it sort of increased the accuracy of that, and we felt very confident with those. And sort of just using the latest technology like the commercial data that you identified, it helps us get the best address for the voter.
And I want to be clear, when we use the commercial data, we don't circumvent NVRA. The commercial data lets us find them and then do the mailings and contact them. So I don't want it to feel like we're using the commercial data to remove those individuals. It's to find them, contact them, and follow the NVRA process.
I know a lot of states also focus on reaching the voter when they're paying attention. So whether you go through your NVRA process, and it may not be around election time, typically it's not, but then voters are looking as you head into an election, and so making sure they know they can look up their registrations, as you mentioned, that they can use online registration, so that if they were removed or they need to move themselves because they've changed addresses, that's available and they're educated as they're paying attention to the election, because no one's thinking about the election 200 days out, but 30 days out they're sure paying attention.
And amplifying your message by having good partnerships with various stakeholder groups, participating in National Voter Registration Day, which continues to grow as kind of a national awareness of making sure your registration's updated, or even that you have one. I think really trying to capitalize on other channels that can help to magnify your effort, because you're right, there are a lack of resources. It's not that everyone could be out in the field all of the time educating voters, but there are groups and organizations that want to do that, and so making sure that they're providing accurate and correct information is really critical.
Yeah, and I know for many states they were stunned when Facebook put up the notices to voters about, hey, make sure you're registered, make sure you, and states were overwhelmed with the response, right, via something as simple as Facebook, and that was reaching voters when they were paying attention this last election cycle and the impact of that. That goes, just 2 more kind of questions and then we can wrap up, but that goes to the conversation about the voter experience, and the voter experience both in interacting with the process. They want and assume their information is up to date and that you have it already, and the impact that has on election day. But then also the voter experience and having confidence in the process, that wanting to answer the question about what steps you all are taking to ensure that the process has integrity to it and the access to it. And so, Tammie, I'll start with you because the PCA focused on this a lot. Why was this issue of list maintenance and modernizing the process so important to the PCA in relation to the voter experience?
Right, so the PCA came about because in the 2012 election, we had voters in this country that were standing in line waiting to vote for hours upon hours upon hours. You know, that just seemed pretty unacceptable. And so what we came out with in the report was a goal that voters shouldn't have to wait for more than half an hour. Now, there are going to be times when that's stretched to the limit. We know that voters are procrastinators sometimes, so the last couple days of early voting, there are going to be lines at many early voting sites because people didn't come in the first couple of weeks. They wait till the end. The same on election day, there'll be lines early in the morning, late in the day. But ultimately, we wanted to look and make sure that the resources were being allocated, and the reason the lines were forming were not because of bad lists, were not because the paper rosters were printed 2 months before the election, because that's when they had to be printed in order to get them prepared and ready to be shipped out to the polling places, which is why we recommended something like electronic poll books, so that you are using the most current and up-to-date list that you can to improve the voters' experience. We, talked about things like the reduction of provisional ballots, and voters don't understand provisional ballots necessarily as being any sort of a safety net. They just know that they've been shuttled off to another line.
They think they've done something wrong.
They think they've
right?
done something wrong. Yeah. And so really trying to lay out a very practical way in which local officials, state legislatures can take a look at, and it warms my heart to hear data being used in this conversation in the discussion about percentages of inactive voters per precinct. Just makes me giddy. So I think one of the other things we really talked about was making sure that we're collecting data and using data to make informed decisions and not basing it purely on conjecture or anecdotal evidence about, there being a long line somewhere, finding out what exactly does that mean, why did that line form? And so that's really what we wanted to focus on, is that ultimately, I've always said that the only thing that will truly kill democracy is voter apathy. If we can have the most secure system, we can have the best voting technology, but if our voters don't show up, that's when we all have problems. So if we continue to chip away at telling voters that our equipment will be hacked and that they'll be intimidated at the polls, and that it's hard to get registered and it's hard to participate and our government is awful and why would you want to play this game anyway? That's truly, I think, where we will get into a very difficult situation. So I think we need to do everything we can to make sure that our system is secure, that it's open and accessible, and that it's a good voting experience, and that people feel confident when they leave the polls or when they cast that ballot, drop it in a ballot box at a drive-through location in Colorado, or they mail it back in Arizona, that they feel that their voice is being heard and that it's being accurately reflected.
I think the hardest thing, like in this last presidential, was I had a few hundred individuals show up to vote and couldn't vote. They were students who had moved from another state. They were showing up to vote for president. They really wanted to vote for president, and there wasn't anything I could do. And that's tough as an election administrator. And so I think we continue to do a better job to talk about not only our part, but their part in making sure that they change their address. And so education is a huge part of that. And I think we could do a better job at it. I don't think any of us have found that magic pill yet that has made that happen. But to increase that responsibility. And I think that's a big part of it. We talk about voters' rights and responsibilities in our state quite a bit, and one of those is a responsibility to update your address. And then look at whatever legislation you have that could support that, whether it's same-day registration or other things that could allow you to address those individuals that kind of get stuck between the state they left and the state that they're coming to is a huge part.
Well, and I know states, and it's talked about in the PCA report, states like Michigan, states like Delaware, now states like New Jersey that have worked collaboratively with their motor vehicle offices to make the process as seamless as they can for the voter, and then down into their office, that data is exchanged. So if they do go to the BMV, it ensures that data is exchanged right to them.
But for a community like mine, a lot of those students don't get driver's
Right, sure.
licenses from Kansas. They retain a driver's license from their other state. So that doesn't capture a lot of my individuals.
That's a great point.
And we did mention in the report about the Department of Motor Vehicles and making sure that, we specifically said we're not trying to articulate that we need any new federal laws. This is purely, some recommendations, but we should enforce the existing federal laws that we do have, like NVRA. So if you're a state that's just handing out a blank voter registration form at your DMV, that's not NVRA compliant. And so making sure that there is full integration and that it makes sense when the voters are there. Looking at what they're doing in Delaware is just the perfect example of it actually reduces the line length at DMV as well when it's done well enough.
So the other part of this is allowing voters to have confidence in the process. They hear a lot about the lists and whether they're up to date or not. And so what is your, and I'll start with you, Secretary Warner, what's your 2-minute, 3-minute elevator speech when voters ask you, what steps are you taking to ensure the lists are up to date, current, and well maintained?
We have an unfortunate situation in one of our counties, had 22,000 registered names, all right? But once that list was cleaned up, 9,000 of those names came off, all right? Now, let me give you the example of somebody, an election, a hypothetical election where 10,000 people vote. If 10,000 people vote and there are 23,000 names on the list, it's less than a 50% turnout. Once those 9,000 names come off, it's 13,000 registered voters. They've seen 10,000 people vote. You have an 85% turnout. Which election are you going to have more confidence in? Which one are you going to feel that representative that we elected really represents the people? Once those voter lists are cleaned up. So that's why I've taken on that task as the #1 thing for us to address in restoring confidence in the elections in West Virginia. And that's why, and it's resonating with the clerks. The clerks want to do a good job. They are very, back to the issue of cleaning up the rolls. I don't take the names off the registration list, okay? Those clerks do, and they do it because they take what is their job. They're the chief election officer in that county, and they take pride in that because they were elected in that county. They know the people in that county, and they're the ones who are in the position to take those names off and clean up those lists. It's my job to get them the resources so they can do the job properly. So that's what we're doing to restore confidence in the elections.
The interesting thing is sometimes NVRA can be the barrier. I have a lot of people who will come to the polling place that I told you last election my daughter didn't live here. Why isn't she off the list? And you have to explain, well, until she tells me, she's going to sit there for 2 federal elections. And so you have people who will think I'm not doing my job because I'm following NVRA. So I think part of my job is to educate what that process is. Before this last election, security was a big issue. So lots of us went out and did a lot of public relations on our security processes. I think we could be better at, before we do an NCOA mailing, doing a press release on, hey, here's why we're doing this. This is what this process looks like. And maybe, once or twice a year doing some sort of press event that says, this is the process I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, and here's how you can assist me in this. It's not something that we, once again, it's not very sexy, so it's not a huge press release. The press may not grab it, but I think that's something we could do better at.
And therein lies the challenge when it's a student, because you know that you've sent mailings that they didn't return to sender, right? They just threw it in the garbage, and so it's never going to trigger NVRA. So the design of the mailings is also really critical. If you have on there, if this person no longer lives here, return to sender, on the front of it, sometimes the messaging has to be on the mail piece as well, and that sometimes that can help increase the return rate. It doesn't guarantee it, but it can be a mechanism to at least increase the amount of them that come back.
And I wanted to follow up with you from a point you made earlier, which is you mentioned the address change service, which is data from the Postal Service that you can automatically load. If I'm a local election official that wants to take advantage, or a state that wants to take advantage of the address change service, how do I do so?
So a couple of ways. Anybody that's already using a mailing house vendor, they'll be able to tell you all about ACS. And in fact, if you're using bulk mailings and or intelligent mail barcode, it's a free service. It's part of the full service. So you just talk to your vendors, your mail houses. If you're someplace that does it all in-house in your own county or state mail room, you'll want to get with your local postmaster, and they'll be able to explain what you need to do in order to sign up for it.
So with that, I want to give each panelist, we'll start with you, Don, one final comment to reflect on the role of list maintenance as you view it, and perhaps share the one piece of advice, the one tip, the one modernization, whatever it may be, that you'd like to share with the community that you think is most important as they are either in the midst of or about to begin the list maintenance process. So we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think that list maintenance is important, not only because it's federal law, but because there's a lot of scrutiny. But a lot of it has to do with the expectations of the voters and other interested parties. The expectations of voters is that they probably are a little bit more optimistic in our ability to track their mobility and sort of have more of a mobile registration. We have to, again, it's education, but it's also us using all the tools in the toolbox and sort of on a micro level, everybody doing list maintenance every day, with the exception of those periods of time of elections. And sometimes that takes a little uniformity from a state level. It's sort of my role was to sort of make sure that all the localities were engaged in some sort of list maintenance in cooperation with the state. The state level is where it's all at. I mean, the responsibility often lies with them, for good and for bad. It's going to be difficult in some days and less difficult in others, but I think that it's an important thing that the American people are watching. We've learned today that it has ramifications, and sort of the efficient administration of elections. And the messier rules are, the more difficult it may be on election day. So we have a lot of reasons to do this, both state and federal interest, and we're just going to do the best we can with all the tools that we have available.
Thank you, Don. Secretary Warner.
I'm going to end where I began, and that is listening to the clerks. There's just nothing more important, and let me give you the example with Eric. The type A personality in me wanted to get into office and start running those lists and take off as many names as quickly as it could. But I found out that once you start this ERIC process, there's requirements that 95%, you have to have 95% return for accuracy, and for our we need to do our part in West Virginia, just like the other states have to do their part for this system to work accurately. For me to get a 95% return on these cards when we send them out, I've got to have the clerks. If some of my clerks say, no, I don't like it because of the way it was initially rolled out, and they hold off, I'm not going to meet that requirement for the state of West Virginia. So I had to slow up, take a step back, listen to the clerks, educate the clerks, work with the clerks, so that we go into this together, both the state and the counties together go into this process for the ERIC system to work. Then the next thing I would mention, following up on what Don said, is you have to use all the resources available. The Kansas Crosscheck, that's a free service. I just do not understand why other states aren't participating. So I went to the NAS conference just a month or so ago, learned a lot from the secretaries that were there, but I'm looking forward to the one in June or July in Indianapolis, because it's going to expose me to a lot of more secretaries. I'll be more familiar with them, and I'll be asking them, why aren't you into Kansas Crosscheck? Why aren't you using ERIC? Those seem like wonderful tools. It seems to be working for me. And some of them back a month ago were the ones that said, hey, ERIC's working for us. So that's what caused me to go back to the clerks and say, hey, not so fast. You wanted to pull the funding, you wanted to pull the authority from me to be able to clean up those roles if you didn't, which is a requirement of the ERIC system. So I had to get educated myself from the clerks, from the ERIC process, then turn that back around and educate the clerks why I need them as we all move forward together. So it's a collaborative process, and so that's where I'm saying I'm ending up where I began, and it is communicating, listening, and then deciding what needs to be done at what point, and then leading. And that's my message for my short 60 days in office in West Virginia.
Thank you so much. Tammie, I'll turn it to you, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because it's something that's incredibly important that I know you wanted to touch on anyway, which is as we talk about list maintenance, serving military and overseas voters, and the steps you can take in a list maintenance process to reach out to them. So in concluding, if you could wrap that into some of your comments as well, that'd be great.
Sure. So what I have kind of planned to synthesize all of this is really, take a look at your system. Take a look at the information that you have and what it's telling you. Take a look at what your provisionals are on Election Day, what your modifications are. If you're an Election Day registration state, why are you having voters making these changes on Election Day? Taking a look at your undeliverable as addressed. Arapahoe County in their new Colorado model found that they had almost cut down by half almost their undeliverable as addressed ballots that were mailed out. So take a look and finding out where the inefficiencies are and trying to pivot on that and capitalize and remedy where those failings are. I would also say when you're looking at your military and overseas voters, your UACAVA voters, take a look to see what it is in your state that's putting the voter on the voter rolls. And what I mean by that is that it was one of the surprises in the PCA was the knowledge that I found out that not everyone really registers military and overseas voters if they submit a voter registration using the federal postcard application, the FPCA. That what they do is they allow them to vote for a year, and at the end of that year, they are no longer a voter. They never appear on an active roll, so when turnout is determined, their ballot is counted in the numerator, but they are not in the denominator in active voter rolls. So they're actually inflating turnout at the expense of our military and overseas voters, which I took great offense at. But I think what states need to do is take a look at how are we servicing our voters that are military and overseas. And the federal postcard application says it's for voter registration purposes and a ballot application. And I think the majority of states use list maintenance for the federal postcard application as the ballot application and not affecting their registration. Their registration falls under the regular NVRA process. So I would just be hopeful that we would take a look at how we're servicing that voting population and that we're not merely canceling them at the end of every year and requiring those individuals who are not locally available that they have to re-register every year. There's no other voter that we require that they re-register every year, but yet some states do that for military and overseas.
This is the Montessori in me. I know we are going to finish, but I know both of you, both are former military, served. Any thoughts to follow up on how to serve these military and overseas voters as you look at a list maintenance voter education outreach process?
Well, I've always said that the airwaves and education at the unit level is most important. I mean, I was a lieutenant commander in the Navy overseas, and I was actually the voting guy, right? Which is now my handle. But the bottom line is I barely knew how to register to vote myself, and I'm trying to tell the other lawyers in the office and other legal men how to register in their state, and it was confusing. And so I would just say that if there's anything more that the Federal Voting Assistance Program and DOD officials can do to sort of educate, just on a general level, specific general, that would help turnout and registration rates of the military. That's the bottom line, and it's difficult. I received one of my ballots with the Thanksgiving mail. That was a while back, but these things happen. But I think education and sort of use of technology are the two big solutions, in my opinion.
He hit the nail on the head. Having been in Afghanistan for 5 years, I had experienced both ends of the spectrum. One, there was a pilot program that was taking place where you could do online voting as an overseas military person, and it worked wonderfully for me. I was like, this is the future of elections. Now I realize that opens up a whole other can of worms, the online voting, and all the cyber stuff and the Russian hacking. I realize there's huge trouble with that, but I can tell you there are soldiers in the Konar region of Afghanistan who will not get mail, cannot get mail, sailors on ships that have difficulty with it. It'll arrive with your Thanksgiving, 3 weeks after the elections have taken place. So we've got to find a way to use technology to allow those soldiers, the soldiers are wired. We are technically the most advanced military on the face of the earth, and in the Konar Valley they do have access through GPS to satellites and so forth. They can vote electronically if we give them that opportunity. We just have to figure out the security and how to do that appropriately to let those soldiers and sailors vote. I don't have the answers. I just know that we got to do it to be fair, because there's those people out there putting their lives on the line for us and our democracy, and yet it's difficult for them to vote. We need to make it as easy as possible for them to vote.
Yeah, Yeah, and I know the one constant with all voters and UOCAVA voters in particular for state and local officials is the diligence, the constant outreach, the constant education, working through whatever bases or installations you may have to do the best education you can, because you have a very short area of time to talk to them, to communicate with them. And I know FFAP has spent a great deal of time and resources kind of looking at the most efficient way to do that education and to improve that. I know that was a big focus for this election. So Jamie, appropriately, you get last word on list maintenance as the local election official here at this table that's really doing the nuts and bolts of this process. So.
Well, the first part is my staff does. I get out of their way. You know, I'll jump on your laundry part.
Yeah.
If you don't do your laundry, of course you've got a bunch of dirty laundry. But in my house, we have tons of clean laundry. The problem is getting it folded and in the drawers, and so we have to enlist everybody, kids, all of us, to do that. I think that's the biggest part. As a local election official, you have to enlist everybody. The state level, the EAC, your community leaders, whoever your stakeholders are, your organizations, your staff, your election boards, everybody is part of this effort. It's not just you. And I think that's the biggest part for you to know, is that you have to pull together a team, just like you do for Election Day, where you pull together a team to pull off Election Day. You need a team to pull off list maintenance, and that's how you're successful with it.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank all four of you for your time, for your willingness to share your expertise. I think what we heard today is, one, that the power of data and the power of data sharing, both to improve list maintenance, but also to benchmark and know where your issues are. And this comes, this is part of the bingo, but this is part of the election officials being IT managers, right? Managing a lot of data and understanding what that data is telling them. Secretary Warner, I think your line, the communication up and down the chain, which is exactly what you were just saying too, bringing everyone together and understanding the challenges and how we can improve. And then recognizing that this is a constant ongoing effort, which means a commitment of resources and time constantly to maintain good lists. And in the end, what you get is a good list, which is the backbone of the process and ensures a better voter experience with greater confidence in the process, which is something all of us and all election officials want. So I want to thank you for your time, your willingness. I'll put in a plug. Follow the work that EAC is doing on this. We've had an ongoing maintenance month. Maintenance Monday blogs from Pasco County, Orange County, California, Arapahoe County, Colorado, election officials sharing their information. Hashtag GamePlan17 on Twitter. So follow EAC on Twitter, Facebook, go to eac.gov. A lot of resources already up, a lot more resources to come, and that'll wrap this up, our maiden voyage on Facebook Live. So thank you all for your time and being willing to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you.